What is happening at Michigan, though? There's a lot going on. Michigan in the news for some good reasons and some nationally recognized reasons today. But Jim Harbaugh, as we speak, reportedly interviewing for a job with the Minnesota Vikings, and yet there sits the Michigan Wolverines signing class currently in the top 10. We've got to make sense of this because there's a lot going on, and here to unpack that is Allan Trieu, 24/7 Sports recruiting analyst, also a guy very, very close to this scene in and around Ann Arbor. So, Allan, I got to start with this, man. I know what I think. Everyone nationally has an opinion on this. On the ground there, close to the program, what do the locals think about this?
Well, I think there was some shock, but it's been reported for long enough now that I think some of that's worn off and everybody's now just waiting and ready for this thing to be over, especially with it being National Signing Day and knowing that he's in Minnesota. I think the locals are ready to have this move on if indeed Jim Harbaugh is moving on and have them turn the page to whoever the next coach is.
Allan, I mean, it's kind of it's kind of low-hanging fruit, but I'm going to ask you anyway. You got a percentage here? Are you crystal balling Jim Harbaugh one way or the other? That's what I'm trying to ask you.
Oh, man, that is, I don't want to ruin my sterling recruiting crystal ball percentage, but if I had my first coaching crystal ball, I would predict right now that he's going to go. He is in Minnesota. He's had plenty of chances to put this thing to bed and say he's not interested and he wants to stay at Michigan. He hasn't done that. He's obviously pursuing these NFL jobs. They are pursuing him. And with him being there in Minnesota, this thing seems like they're at least in the red zone and trying to punch it in today.
Yeah, Key's not guaranteed to work if and when he does try and come back and take over that old job he currently has. So this is not new. These rumors have been around for weeks now. And I think the question on my mind from Michigan's perspective is, how were they or were they not going to let this sneak up on them? I gotta imagine there's some sharp people up there in that athletic department. If due diligence was done, and theoretically you're right, and Jim Harbaugh does take the NFL job, how quickly could we expect them to move on naming his replacement?
I think you think they would move pretty quickly here, especially because you've got spring ball coming up. 2023 recruiting is in full swing. You've got some good candidates. As you mentioned, this isn't the first time they've been down this road. Some of the names you're hearing as candidates, these names up on the board, we've heard them in other years. There's also Harold Goodwin from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We've heard that name in past years. So we've been down this road before. There's a couple of good candidates in the building there with Josh Gaddis and Mike Hart. So they've got a good list of names, and I would expect that they wouldn't take too long to name the successor just because of the time of year it is and with the team moving towards spring football.
Allan, is there a lean, as far as you can gather, one way or the other, about requiring that candidate to have been a head coach and to have a proven resume? Or is Michigan a program, for the sake of staff continuity and maybe holding the recruiting class together, that would opt for a Mike Hart or a Josh Gaddis, even understanding that would be their first time as head coaches?
Yeah, I think that all these options are on the table. I don't know that being a head coach previously is a requirement. Josh Gaddis and Mike Hart are two young guys who have proven themselves certainly as recruiters, who I think for several years now we've heard that those guys have head coach in their future. Don't know that we thought it was going to be this soon that they were going to be discussed for it, but those are guys who have been earmarked as potential head coaches down the line. Gaddis has been talked about at other schools as a potential head coach, so that's not a huge surprise. I think for Michigan, it's about getting the right person in, no matter what their background is or where they've been or what the other positions are. If those two guys are deemed worthy of the job, I think they'll be considered regardless of head coach experience.
Allan Trieu with all the latest on Jim Harbaugh and Michigan/Minnesota. Who knows what the rest of the day could bring. Allan, we appreciate it. You can follow him on Twitter, 247sports.com. A really good follow here, especially for this story, among several others that we're following on National Signing Day. And just like that, Cooper Petagna, poof, he pops on the set. You've been in this program, and you've got a lot of ties to the program, a lot of connections in the program. I'm really curious, not on the outside, but if you peel that curtain and we look behind the scenes, what are people saying up there?
Sure. I don't think it's a surprise by any stretch of the imagination. I think beating Ohio State has kind of catapulted Jim Harbaugh into this conversation and makes a lot of sense on a lot of different levels. You think about all the changes in the college football landscape that we've been talking about with the transfer portal and NIL. I think with coaches who especially have experience in the NFL and a guy like Jim Harbaugh who's had a lot of success, that is certainly appealing to go back and really kind of have that balance and that type of focus really on the day-to-day just on football. Now, as far as the search, I think Michigan is a top 5 job in the country. I think Michigan would be wise to take their time with this. We kind of see the benefit with a Notre Dame and a Brian Kelly type of situation where Marcus Freeman, who was obviously right there and was the answer in-house, they were able to keep their recruiting class together. But with a place like Michigan, even though they're coming off a playoff appearance, you have a chance to get this right. There's certainly a higher ceiling there than what they've accomplished in the last handful of years with Jim Harbaugh.
Steve, I know you're over there gathering a lot of information right now, and so I hate to interrupt you, but I just got to do it right quick. We were just talking about Michigan, in case you were dialed in over there, and Jim Harbaugh, specifically from their recruiting class right now, in the standpoint of today's news, how in a state of flux is this class, or have a lot of these kids been sold on committing to Michigan over just committing to the head coach? And so, in other words, if he were to take that Minnesota job, what kind of impact does it have on the class?
Well, they have 22 players already signed, and then they have one young man, Kevontae Henry, who is trending towards Oklahoma on the 24/7 Sports Crystal Ball right now, also considered Arizona. But I think when a lot of these prospects pick Michigan, it's one of those schools where a lot more goes into it than football. They have they have the biggest alumni association in the country, I believe. Cooper, you worked there, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and the Michigan Man thing, it means a lot, and it's such a storied program and terrific academics. I think that a lot of these players buy into Michigan for more than the coaching staff, and it's still a program that when you look at it and you see a coaching change there, you figure it's a place that's probably going to attract a high-level coach or two that's going to be interested in the job, and a lot of guys that'll be a fit in Ann Arbor. So I expect recruiting to perhaps maybe even uptick a little bit, but status quo at the very least with the new staff.
What do you think the overall reaction is around the rest of the Big Ten? If this move is made, outside perception is, well, if a program loses a long-time established head coach, it's a negative for them, it's a positive for the rest of the conference. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not, depends on who replaces them. But what's the perspective, do you think, right now from Penn State or from East Lansing with Michigan State or Ohio State? How much do they really care about this?
They're anxiously awaiting. I think it's a similar type situation to USC and Clay Helton. Now you got Lincoln Riley taking over at USC. And fully expect USC to get back to a standpoint where they're back to their early 2000 days with Pete Carroll. So you look at Michigan, and it's like Steve said, they're sitting there at number 8 in the country, but in terms of what they can do and establish themselves as a power on the recruiting trail consistently year in and year out, as a top 5 program in the country, they're certainly capable of doing that if they get this hire right.
You said something there a couple of minutes ago, and I didn't want to overlook it. You said you thought this was potentially a top 5 job in the country. There are a lot of people who would push back on that. Now, I'm going to remain neutral here. I'm going to balance on the top of the fence, but I want to ask you, in about the minute we have left until break, if someone were to come at you and say, what about all these Southern programs with all these resources, and then you've got Ohio State, and look at what Southern Cal could be under Lincoln Riley, and Texas, and how do you justify Michigan that lofty?
You talk about the number 1 public institution in all the country academically, and then you talk about Stephen Ross and the business school that they have there just off the field, the number 1 alumni base. And if we're going to get into NIL, I think that's going to be a really big factor there. So not only that, you talk about the prestige of Michigan football, there's nothing like it in the country.